nobody around for miles. On my left-hand side, it shrank into nothing, and then it was gone. The first thing I do is I looked up the sky to see if there's a UFO. And my name is Ron. I'm from Central California. I've been a pretty active outdoorsy person pretty much all my life. And I was it's kind of Bigfoot is kind of a thing around here that nobody talks about. Um, I grew up with it, being aware of it, but not really so much, being into it. And my dad had a college history, California history class, and they touched on it in that class. And I think that's my first thing I can remember that had to do with Bigfoot itself. And he brought it up when I was about probably 10 years old, because there was a Bigfoot movie on TV, and he said, "Oh wow, we they they brought up something like that in a history class I had," and he actually still had the book at that time, and evidently a Bigfoot was shot and captured somewhere in what is now Kings Canyon or Sequoia National Park, and they brought it down to Visalia, a little town in Central California. Brought it down to Visalia, and it lived for a couple of days before it finally died. And beyond that, didn't have much really actual interest in it until 1995. Was on a mountain bike ride up in the high country Sierras, and pardon my dog, with some with some friends, and we found a trackway running down the four-wheel drive trail we were going on, and it was fresh. The tracks were laid down on top of a friend of mine who was ahead of us. It was about a quarter to a half mile ahead of us. The tracks were laid down on his tire tracks, and then another friend of mine, an ex friend of mine who's ahead of me, he actually saw the track and stopped in the trail to look at it, and I could hear something moving through the brush off the side of the road, down a little ravine, and it was a classic Bigfoot print, probably 14, about 14 inches long. Came down off the mountain, crossed the road. It stopped in the middle of the road, like it kind of shuffled its feet around, and then continued on into the ravine that I heard in. And so we checked it out and said, wow, that's kind of weird. And then we continued up the trail, and we crossed a track several more times over the next couple miles. And then we came across some bear hunters, and they were wanting to know what we're looking at, and said, "Oh, well, it's a bear footprint." And I meant a bear footprint, and they heard bear footprint, and say, "Oh, let's see." And they all gathered around, and, "Oh, that's not a bear. That's not a bear." And they went off and kind of talked amongst themselves, and then took off. Well, we ended up doing our ride for the rest of the day, and I kind of forgot about it for about 5 years, about 4 years. And then one of those hunters was on the news. One of the local news stations was doing a segment on Bigfoot, and he was on it and related his story. And I kind of jarred my memory, so I made a BFRO report on it, and then basically proceeded to forget about it again, for probably 2 decades. And then in the 2010s or so, through my interest in anthropology and whatnot, um, I got a chance to speak with a Miwok tribal elder. They're a group of Native Americans in the Sierra Nevada foothills, and I got a chance to talk to him, and the subject of the giant came up, and I found out that the Central California, most of the Northern California Native Americans had a story of what they call the giant in some fashion or another, and um, in the Miwok language, it's called Yayale, Yayale the giant, and he's given certain human attributes. Um, and in some stories, they have several stories about Yale. In some stories, it he the Bigfoot is a um, almost a predator, and something that you really want to stay away from. And then in other stories, not so much. Um, but I came to find out that, like I said, all the local tribes had stories about Bigfoot, and in one particular place, there are 5 different names for Bigfoot within maybe a 5 mile radius, where all those different tribal groups where their borders all touch each other. And so when I learned all that, I got kind of interested, but I was still skeptical because of, you know, if there's something that big roaming around, we should be able to find it. We should have found one by now, or something more than blurry pictures or a you know indeterminate track or whatever. And I just kind of it was kind of a not really a hobby. I was kind of interested in it, but only as far as how to relate to the anthropology and history of California until 2018. Um, and then that spring, well, that starting in January that year, and then throughout the spring into summer, I had several encounters. Um, that's the only way I put it. I didn't actually see one, but I was in several places where there were at least one, probably two in the immediate vicinity. Um, and in the same time over that spring, I I got a new podcast player, and it would just kind of randomly recommend podcasts to listen to, um, you know, on all different kinds of subjects. And it recommended a Bigfoot podcast. And so I started listening to the accounts by people, accounts, the people relate their accounts. And I started to recognize a lot of behaviors that other people are describing. I had experienced almost all of them at some point or another since I was a child in this part of the Sierras. And then that summer, well, starting with that January, um, I was riding up a really steep trail, um, and it's behind a locked gate, so I know I'm the only person up on the mountain, and I'm going up the mountain, and I thought I could hear something over my engine noise, and so I stopped because I thought my engine was something was going wrong with my engine, so I stopped, and that wasn't it. So I continued up the trail a little bit, and I stopped at a place where a tree had blown down across the trail, and there was no way I could get around it or get over it. So I figured I'd take a rest there. And then after a couple minutes, I noticed a lone pine tree, probably 20, probably about 20 feet tall. waving back and forth all by itself with none of the other trees around it moving. And I thought, well, that's kind of weird. And so I kept an eye on it, and there was a storm blowing in. That time I was trying to get up and get a ride in and get down before the storm hit. And so I thought, well, maybe that's what they call a mono wind around here. There's a really, really strong downhill wind that starts in the high country and blows down the canyons. And the monos can hit 100, 120 miles an hour. Um, so I thought, well, I need to get going and get out of here, because I can't have trees blow down and cross my path now and not be able to get out. So I started back down the hill, and between where I had stopped to check my motor and where I stopped to take a break, two small pine trees had been pushed down across the trail in an X fashion. And right about that point, I just got this feeling that I needed to not be there. Um, Not really, wasn't fear so much, but just I had that feeling that I should not be there. Um, so I went around the down trees, and they were pushed down in a fashion to where they formed an X about chest high for me, but they were right next to each other and going opposite ways. So there was no way that a gust of wind could have done that. And they were in fairly at that time it was a fairly thick stand of forest. Um, so I went around it, and I went down the trail about another mile or so, and I stopped, and I just wasn't feeling good, and I thought I was having a heart attack, because I didn't feel good. Hold on a second. I'm gonna close the door. Um, I stopped to take a rest and take a picture of where I was at and post a picture, because friends of mine would know where that location is, and if I didn't make it back to town, then they would know where to look for me. So I was sitting on the rock, looking out over the Sound King Valley, and I turned around, and about a quarter mile up the hill, a single pine tree, started shaking back and forth again, just like the earlier one. And then basically I was overcome with the feeling you shouldn't be here. You need to leave now. And so I took off, and I went home and did my stuff, and kind of forgot about it. And then I started listening to that podcast. And one of the first stories I listened to was somebody talking about trees being pushed down across a road, um, in an encounter they had. And so, I'll listen to that. I'll listen to more of these. I started listening to more of the stories, and all of a sudden, there were various behaviors that I had experienced, like um, rock throwing, and throwing little pebbles. And because when me and my dad would go hunting up in this same general area, um, we would be hunting, and you would see a pine cone come flying out of the manzanita brush and land near us, and there is nothing that can throw anything, in our forest. And at times it's a pine cone, other times it's little rocks, or sticks. An old dead limb, a foot long and an inch in diameter, would just loft out and come over and land near us. My dad would always blow it off, saying it was squirrels, or a dead branch dropped out of a tree. And so it was kind of blew it off. Um, we we also would find hair, hanging in the manzanita, or on the lower branches of trees, um, long reddish brown hair. And it was usually fairly high, like chest high on a child, so 4 feet up. they do run cattle, or they did run cattle in the mountains at that time, but there are no cattle that have hair that long. Usually it was 4 or 6 inches, and we would continue to find hair on mountain bike rides as I was an adult. And some friends of mine would commented on it because we'd be riding on some trail in the middle of nowhere, and there would be this hair hanging off of branches, sticking out of the trail, and and then stuff like that. And then again in this particular area in the mountains, um, we would hear hooting, and but not like an owl. It hoots like an owl, but it's obviously not an owl. Um, you know, if an owl could weigh 600 pounds, that was the kind of hoot it would make. We'd also hear whooping, and sometimes you'd wake up in the middle of the night and it sounded like you were at the primate house at a zoo, and by the howler monkeys, and just never really put too much thought of it. But there's nothing that makes that kind of noise in these mountains. Um, and then on occasions, again in the same place, um, you would hear an almost we would call it the sad coyote, because the coyotes would start up and they start singing and doing coyote stuff, make a lot of noise, and then this other howl would start off separate from the coyotes, a distance away. It was a long, low, kind of mournful howl sound, and the coyotes would go absolutely dead silent, and they would be silent for a few minutes, and then they would start up again and scattered and very excited, yipping and doing coyote stuff, but not gathered around in one spot like they'd been before, but kind of scattered around. And then there would be that howl again, and then the coyotes would be silent again, and stuff like that. And then so later on in 2018, I was riding a motorcycle again in this section of forest, and I stopped and looked up the trail, because I'd seen a trail that I'd never seen before, and I stopped to look at it and try and decide if I was gonna ride up it, and because it was getting late in the day and I was by myself, and so I was trying to decide if I was being prudent or not. And then a shadow moved across a space between the trees where the sunlight was shining through the trees on the bush behind it, and a shadow moved across that space, and that shadow had to have been 8, 9 feet tall, because I could see the brush in the background, the brush in the foreground, and then where the sun was shining through, and just this black shadow moved across, and then a second one moved across a couple seconds later, and I was kind of surprised, because generally deer deer and bear will run. When you get that close to the motorcycle, they'll take off. They don't stick around. Um, and this was only about probably 15 feet from where I was standing. Um, and I saw these two shadows move across, and then the shadow moved back in, like it almost like it was peeking out, and then it moved back, and I could hear something moving up the hill. So, I went about my day. Um, and then that August, in another place, probably about 30 miles away, me and a friend of mine were on a motorcycle ride, and in a fairly remote place, and the local trail maintenance organization was going through and clearing the trail after a big fire. There was a huge fire there in 2017. And we knew they were going to be there and about where they were going to be. And so we decided we'd go riding and let them get ahead, and we'd kind of follow along and, see what kind of work they're doing as they're going. And we got this one spot where they had been, and there were four tracks coming down the hill, four sets of tracks coming down the hill. Um, Two adults and two children, well, two small ones, um, barefoot, human-like tracks across a burn scar out off the mountain that doesn't have any roads going to it, down to a creek, crossed the creek, got on a dirt road. It's more of a trail than a road. Walked up the road and then back up the mountain, back into the brush. And the direction they were coming from and going to, there's no roads at all in there. The next road would be probably 5 or 6 miles away. And that pretty much sealed it. So from that point on, I became a believer for the most part. And then, since I knew what to look for and what to listen for, um, I I started to have more encounters, so to speak. Because usually when I was riding motorcycle, most of the time I was riding by myself in off hours. So like if I went out riding on Sunday, I would go in the afternoon when everybody's leaving to come home. I would be going out, and I'd go out by myself. And when I'd stop, I'd be quiet because I'm a pretty quiet person. And you get usually when you get a group of motorcycle riders together, they're a loud, boisterous group. They're same with just about anything with bicyclists or hunters. For the most part, they're out there being people and they make noise. And so you might not hear the things that you would hear when you're by yourself. Um, yeah, so that's how I got into it.
Wow, that's quite a story. I have a lot of good questions for you. Let's
Okay.
go back to now your father learned about Bigfoot in a history class, is that right?
Yes, in a California history class.
And is that where he heard about the Bigfoot being shot and taken somewhere?
It was in his textbook. A textbook published in, if I remember right, it was published in the 30s because he would have been in school in the 60s, the early 60s. Um, and so the our local college is about 100 years old or so. Um, yeah, about 100. And so they still would have had books from when they're from their early days. So what this class he had a little chapter on, the wild man. That's how they called it. It was the wild man. And they had shot a wild man and took it captive, and it succumbed to its injuries. And I think that was in the 1870s. Because about right 1860s, 1870s is when this part of the Sierras they started to settle it pretty heavily. And
Where did they take this body?
it was a town called Visalia, and it's so they took it, they carried it for, Visalia is probably 50, 60 miles from the mountains, the high country, wherever it was that they got it. I wish I had read that a little bit later when I was an adult, because I would be able to tell where they were at. Um, yeah, supposedly one was shot, or the wild man was shot, um, and was described as fairly big and hairy, and that was all they really said about it, because it was more of a, it was an 1870s kind of thing. Um, just the wild man. And there's other accounts of wild men in California history. If you look deep enough and you know where to look, you'll find stories in period newspapers and whatnot about various wild men that were killed or run off or whatnot. Um, yeah, I know of a couple stories. I don't know where to find them, but there are a couple stories from Northern California and one from Southern California.
Well, this is really interesting. I haven't heard about them using this like as a college course or a textbook within a college history
It was
course.
just a it
Interesting.
was just a little aside. It wasn't part of the course per se, but the book was more or less about the history of the local area. Um, so it would have had to do with the history of Visalia and Tulare and some of the communities in the foothills in Tulare County and Fresno, eastern Fresno County. It was kind of just I don't know how to put it. It was it was kind of an aside to the broader story of what was going on at that time. And that was the only story I read in that book. So I don't really know what the rest of the book was about, but it was in a college history book, textbook, probably from the late 30s, I'd say.
Do you happen to remember the name of the book?
Nope, I sure don't.
Okay.
And I asked my dad if he kept it, and he doesn't know what happened to it. He probably got rid of it, 40 years ago.
Yeah, that would be most likely. That I can understand that completely. What were his thoughts on that issue? Did you discuss that with him?
Um, he is not necessarily a believer, but not a not believer. Um, because so our family has a connection with that area of the mountains in some fashion. We're really not sure what the connection is, but it's a family connection. So his mother's sister knew the people who had homesteaded a cabin in that area in the late 1890s, and so it's through them that we started. Well, he's been going up there camping since he was a boy, since the 40s, and I've been going up there camping since I was a baby. And uh, Bigfoot is kind of like I said, it's kind of a thing in a local community um, that everybody knows about, but nobody talks about. Um, because the closest town to this place where we camp, closest town is a little town called North Fork, and North Fork has had giant footprints painted through town for as long as I can remember. Certainly since before 1967, um, and probably goes back to the 40s or 30s or so, because that town was in its heyday in the late 30s. Um, and they're I don't know what they called it. They used to call it wasn't Bigfoot. They called it the something trail. And on the main road through town, they had these giant footprints painted. And even to this day, as you go around the little roads around this community, you'll see you'll see Bigfoot cutouts and you know Bigfoot silhouettes squirreled away on various people's property. And the next town to the north, Oakhurst, which is the south entrance to Yosemite, um, Oakhurst had a Bigfoot burger. It was a burger joint there from the early 50s until the middle 70s, and so they had a Bigfoot themed, burger joint before Bigfoot kind of became a well known thing. And in fact, the first reported sighting in the area was 1948, I think, when a couple hunters going up to a place that I know reported as seeing this hulking, long-haired wild man, basically, when they're out deer hunting. And and you can, if you ask enough people, you'll find somebody that'll will have had an experience, and there's still reported experiences um, to this day. Um, a few years ago, there was uh, a woman who lived on the Indian Rancheria. It's kind of like a reservation, but not official reservation, but it's a reservation. It's got a California state reservation, basically. Um, Lives in the back, which is right at the bottom of the ridge that this place I camp at is on. And she said that something had been getting into her garbage, even though she had it chained up and locked. It wasn't locked with like a lock, but it was it was secured where you would need fingers and a thumb to be able to open it up. And something opened it up and got into her garbage, and would close it, and she would hear um, something knocking on the sides of her house on occasion. Um, and then in the summer of 21, um, a man and his kid were up camping near the south entrance to Yosemite, and they got ran off in the middle of the night by one. Um, and they left their tent and all their camping gear. They left it where it sat, and they just took off and left it there. And me and my friend, we came across that, and I didn't know that had happened yet. We came across that camp, and he wondered, wow, why somebody just took off and left all the shit here, and why did they do that? And then a couple weeks later, I heard about it from a local Bigfoot researcher, and it was making the rounds of a couple local mountain pages. And so there's still a fair number of encounters reported around here. Um, the last one I could think of, well, last encounter I had um, was in August of 21, and I was again in a really remote area on a motorcycle ride by myself, and I was I was trying to find an old trail that was on an old map and hasn't been on the map for 20 or 30 years, and I found the lower part of the trail, and I was working my way up it, and I got to basically it was an old campground that Forest Service shut down, 30, 40 years ago. And I got there, and I parked the motorcycle, and I walked back down the trail to take some pictures. And when I was walking back up the trail, I found a set of footprints that were laid down after I'd gone down the trail. So, um, whatever made the footprints made them within, a 5 minute window. And I was able to get a picture of one of them. They're in a place in the soil with the soil conditions and the lighting conditions. You couldn't see them so much. But with all the pictures I took, I was able to get three pictures where you could see the actual footprint. Um, and then there was also a handprint and a knuckle print where it almost like it had gone into a football player's stance, with one hand on the ground, and then it took off across the trail and went elsewhere. Um, and that location is only about 2 miles from location we had where we had found the trackway going through the burn scar. And when I looked into the history of the area, there are some aspects of actual history that didn't really make sense, but when you look at it in those terms, they kind of make sense. Um, like one of the things I learned from the tribal elder, that the word Yosemite um, might be a mistranslation um, for 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 Bigfoot or the giant, because the first European Americans into Yosemite came in through the south. The south came in kind of from the south, and the area they went through. See, one, they had to cross three Indian tribes' territory to get there, and so they're having other tribes translate for them. And what this elder said is that um, Yosemite means gaping maw in the language of the Awanichis, the tribe that occupied Yosemite Valley itself, and it means big mouth or gaping maw. And the big mouth or gaping maw is a common theme in how Bigfoot is depicted, especially in the Northwest, like on totems. They'll have totems that have Bigfoot's face carved into it, but it's always been considered a mythical creature by anthropologists and stuff, and just you know something made up. And one of these tribes um, has a story that when they when they ran the last of the giant out of their territory, they built a dance house, basically a ceremonial house, and that house is still there in a place called Nipawanassee. And if Nipawanassee is at the bottom of a canyon that leads to this place that I had found the footprint in. And yeah, there's a deep history as far as Native Americans go in this area, um, for Bigfoot. Um, yeah,
have you heard the Sierra Sounds?
yes, I have.
And what is your view on that?
Um, it's very intriguing. Um, some of the noises are very familiar, like some of the calls. Not so much the vocalization, kind of verbiage I haven't really heard, but some of the calls, some of the whoops and the hoots, um, it's very familiar, and I think I know where that place is at. I have a general idea um, of where it's at, and it's remote. It's in the middle of nowhere, um, and one time in 2000, see, I think it was 2016. Me and my riding buddy, we did a off-road motorcycle ride from his house. He lives in Oakhurst in the mountains. We did a ride from his house north to Sonora, California, a gold country town. It's about 120 miles from his house, and we took trails and four-wheel drive roads and all sorts of stuff to get there. And we had pulled over to do a map check um, on the uh, it's on a little river that is a tributary of the Stanislaus River, I think. I can't remember the name of it. But we're on this little Jeep track. The nearest paved road is probably 5 miles in any direction. Actually, 5 miles in one direction, 25 or 30 miles in the other direction. And so we're sitting there doing a map check, and little stones started to come out of the brush and land in the clearing we were in. And it threw, probably 5 or 6 stones. And then, we both got the feeling that we shouldn't be there. And we actually turned and looked at each other and said, "Hey, we should go." Um, and we put our helmets on the left. And I, I think that we can subconsciously smell them, and that is what's behind the, when people think they're being watched, or they know that there's something there, or they feel they shouldn't be there. You got to leave. It's not safe to be here, but you can't put your finger on why you feel that way. I think it has to do with smell. Um, something you can't necessarily pick up consciously, but it's there, and your brain knows it's there, and your defensive instinct kicks in to leave. And so that's happened to us several times on motorcycle rides in various locations, where we'd be stopped and take a rest, and then we'd have pebbles thrown at us. um, and it's usually in a fairly remote place, on a road that nobody, a road or a trail that hardly ever gets used. um, and it's interesting, to say the least. But like I said, it's happened several times. With this event in particular, it's been several times we've been out somewhere, and that has happened.
What do you think of people who see orbs and things like that when they're out in a wooded area? Have you ever seen anything like that?
Yes. In 2005, I was going motorcycle riding on a motorcycle ride, and with a club I used to belong to that has property just northwest of Lake Tahoe. They're on the western slope of the Sierras, below the pass, um, down below 80, Interstate 80. And anybody who was a club member could get access to property, camp there, and ride from there. And so that's what we did. I met a friend of mine from San Francisco at the property, and we were going to do a 40 or 50 mile off road ride, and then camp out, and then do another ride the next day, and then each go home. And so we went and we did our ride, and in our ride we were really in the middle of nowhere. Even in the middle of nowhere, as far as what I would consider the middle of nowhere. We're in nowhere. There was no trail. We were basically bushwhacking through the forest, and came to a spot where we found scat piles on rocks, and the rocks were placed in the forest in a place where there's no rocks. And then there's a scat pile on top of it that looks like a big giant human turd, like giant human turd. And there were a line of these. They're about maybe 50 or 100 feet apart, down this little draw. And it was obvious that something was marking its territory that way. So we did a ride. We went back to camp, and we were pretty low maintenance campers at that point. Um, all I took camping with me was my sleeping bag and maybe a stove. Um, and then the other guy was pretty much the same way. So after our ride, we were tired. We were out riding for 12 hours, and we were just sitting there in our lawn chairs, sitting there doing nothing at dusk. And I was kind of trying to stay awake, and I was looking down at my feet, and I saw this blue glow on the ground in front of me, kind of between us. And the first thought went through my head was it was like the light from an old cell phone, when the light it projects, that kind of blue color. And so I looked up to see if my buddy was, doing something with his phone, and there was this basketball sized bluish translucent orb, um, about 3 foot off the ground, probably 4 or 5 feet from me. And I, I, I was dumbfounded actually. Um, and I'm sitting there staring at it, and I stared at it for a few seconds, and I looked at my friend and said, "Hey, do you see this?" And he was looking at it, and he goes, "Yeah, what do you see?" And he goes, "Well, there's a blue orb." But here's the weird thing is that we saw the blue orb at apparently different sizes from each of our perspectives. So I saw it, it was like basketball size, roughly. Then what he was looking at, he thought it was more like softball size. But then when it disappeared, but it didn't disappear. It was like, from my point of view, it was like receded back to a point where you just couldn't see it anymore. But there was brush back there 5 feet behind it, so it couldn't have gone, back. It would have to have gone into the brush. And my buddy, who was sitting off on my left hand side, he described the same things, that it kind of shrank into nothing and then it was gone. And when it disappeared, the first thing I did was I looked up the sky to see if there's a UFO or something. and and then I checked my watch to see if we'd lost any time, but we hadn't lost any time, and there was no UFO. And so we kind of said, "Wow, yeah, that's weird." And it really had an effect on my buddy because he didn't want to talk about it. And when we got up the next morning, we were supposed to go ride again. He goes, "No, I'm done. I'm going to go home. Yeah, I'm done. I'm going home." And so he went home, and he would never talk about that after it happened. Um, and when I got home, I got on the internet and I looked up ghost lights, and sure enough, the Tahoe ghost lights are a thing. Um, and they're in the Tahoe area. They're associated with the Donner Party and Donner Party spirits and stuff. And where we were camped out is basically where the Donner Party, the one group of the Donner Party, when they tried to get out and get help, went through there at that went through that place. And it's actually one of the little trails we're riding on was the trail that they used. And so I just always kind of, chalked it up to a ghost light or whatever. And then I found out that, orbs are kind of a Bigfoot thing too. So I don't know what to think of that. I yeah, I don't know what to think in that, but I have experienced orbs. A big
Yeah,
giant orb, actually.
I think a lot of people do experience orbs in the woods, not necessarily always with a Bigfoot, but sometimes in an area when they're Bigfoot researching, that there'll be one there. But then I've heard other stories where they see a Bigfoot turn into an orb and an orb turn into a Bigfoot. So yeah, I think it's difficult to say, exactly what the
Yeah.
correlation is. So you didn't see a craft then overhead. I know Ron
No.
Moore, when he was at his campsite and a lot of things were happening. And at one point, they saw this enormous blue craft overhead. Have you
Oh wow.
ever seen a UFO or a craft like that, or any kind of
Um,
craft?
oh yeah. For this area, particularly Central California, is kind of a secret hotspot for UFOs. Um, Namely because Area 51 is only 100 miles away, and in the day, I think they probably still do it now. They will fly aircraft over specifically with the intent that it gets reported, and they'll troll the reports to see who reports it and what somebody saw, or what phenomena they're reporting. Um, and I've seen various lights here in the valley. Um, I took a video of one in October of 21. It was just above house height. Um, it was what we would see around here. We'd see on relatively regularly a multicolored orb, either stationary or slowly moving, and definitely not a drone, not an airplane, um, not a helicopter. Um, and then, we would see on occasion, you'd see these high speed lights, um, going by that are not a satellite, going too fast to be an airplane, or changing direction in such a fashion to as to preclude anything we would have. Um, and I have actually seen something over Mammoth Mountain. Um, it was basically a large black triangle. That's the only way to describe it. It wasn't so much I could see it, but as it went over, I could not see the stars behind it as it passed. Um, and it was moving silently and probably 300 or 400 feet above the mountains that we were at that point. Um, but the interesting thing is the direction it was going would take it right to Area 51. Um, so a certain portion of the things we see in the sky are ours, and then a certain portion we see in the sky are not ours. And actually, one of the incidents that the Navy reported a few years ago was off the Central California coast, and that uh, that particular incident, the object showed up on a civilian air traffic control radar, and it stayed in place for 6 weeks at 80,000 feet. And it occasionally would come down to sea level and then go back up to 80,000 feet, almost in an instant. And there is nothing in anybody's inventory that can do that. And, a drone can't stay out that long. It's not a balloon. Um, and air traffic control would get the local naval base, because there's a couple military bases around, and so they would get um, whatever squadron was flying out of Lemoore Naval Air Station to go out and check it out and see if it's still there. And they would go out, and sure enough, there's this. It was one of the Tic Tacs. There's a Tic Tac there, and it's just sitting there, you know, 60,000 feet or 80,000 feet. And then, they'd fly up to it and it would take off, but then it would come back. And yeah, there's definitely some stuff going on, and
Well, what else can you tell me about Bigfoot before we close out our interview today? Is there anything that we haven't covered?
um, you know, uh, I don't know. I could, all the little things that happen in various times over the past, 50 years. I've had my face touched in a tent. Um, I had something throw a dead limb at me when I was on a motorcycle ride, and I just ducked and just missed it. And if it had hit me, it would have taken my head off. Um, in a place where there's verifiably nobody around for miles, um, and stuff like that. Hearing loud footsteps, loud footsteps you can feel in the ground when we're camping in certain places, and just stuff like that. And I kind of think that the whole alien and Bigfoot thing are kind of connected, but they're not connected. Um, my take on it is that there's real natural living flesh Bigfoot, And then there is maybe an alien projection of Bigfoot that they're using to gather information, because that's something that most people, it'll scare them, and or just not associated with aliens or so. But that's even for me, that's kind of out there.
I think we're all on the line now of just wondering what is going on with a lot of
Yeah.
these encounters that people have, whether it be aliens, Bigfoot, ghost activity, all kinds of things.
Mhm.
There are a lot of questions, but certainly people are coming forward with a lot of experiences as well. What do you think of the Patterson Gimlin film?
um Absolutely 100% real. um I actually I saw extended version of the film that, unless you've been to um one of the talks put on by Bob Gimlin in 2018, you haven't seen the film. Because he had a cut of the film that was considerably longer with more stuff in it. And there, in one of them, you can see how it's walking. It moves in a way that a human cannot move, just by how its lower legs move in relation to each other. It's Yeah, and then in one of the earlier sections of film, it's walking behind behind a down log, and it looks like just a down log, and it's walking behind it, and it's maybe knee height on 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 Patty. But earlier on, there's a picture of Roger Patterson standing in front of that down log. That down log is waist high for him. Um, and so, it shows that, well, that a human in a costume was no way it could be human in costume, because there is no human 8 foot tall that's going to be out in the middle of nowhere in a costume. Um, and then, another thing that they don't you don't realize that they were 4 days out on horseback to get to where that picture was taken. There were no roads. You had to get there on horseback. So it would be the kind of thing that would be next to impossible to fake, especially in those days.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'm going to go ahead and end our interview today. I thank you
Okay.
so very, very much for joining me and for sharing all of your experiences, your stories. And I just think it's fascinating that your father knew about Bigfoot from a college textbook. Now that's amazing.
Yeah, it is. That's one of those books I wish I had laid hands on early and kept it.